The aim was to attract global attention for their cause. And arguably, history will show, even in the rain, they succeeded, exceeding their highest expectation of 50,000 people. Pro-Palestinian supporters seizing control of the Sydney Harbour Bridge and turning the iconic landmark into a stage for its first ever anti-war protest. Traffic making way for what organisers called a tidal wave of humanity.
There was a massive protest march on the Sydney Harbour Bridge last week where up to 300,000 people joined the march in pouring rain to push the Australian government to recognise the independent state of Palestine and stop the genocide that's being committed by Israel. And I think it's becoming more obvious by the day that people all around the world have had enough of the inactions by their governments who have got the power to act but just do nothing to stop it. And people have just had enough of the killing, the images of starving children, of all the ruin and wreckage and the one-sided support of the state of Israel. And they can see it with their own eyes, David, and they've had enough of the spin and the lies. And they just do not want to be part of this complicity. And the New South Wales police have suggested that only 100,000 people turned up, which is still a big number anyway. But independent estimates suggest that the number was around 300,000 people, possibly even more. And this was a march for humanity. It was a broad range of people that attended as well. It was Christians, Muslims, Jewish people, peace activists, teachers, nurses, unionists, young people, old people, and everyone in between. Young kids were there, kids in prams. And I think a lot of people just wanted to be there. And while the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns was doing his best to close down the march by going through the courts and appeasing the Zionist lobby, well, a lot of people decided that this was not going to be about politics. It was not going to be about votes. This was purely about humanity. And we have to remember that this was all in the pouring rain. It was cold, it was windy. They were calm, they were patient, and they were there to prove a point that they want the Australian government to stop looking the other way, to stop using the weasel words, to stop selling military parts to Israel and start the action towards a pathway to peace and a pathway to an independent Palestine. That's what people want, and the political process, I think, just has to deliver.
It was an extraordinary day. Thinking was, I think, that the rain was going to keep the numbers down. They were thinking that they'd get 80 to 90,000 people. With the rain, I think they might go down to even as low as 40, which is still a lot of people. But in the end, somewhere in the vicinity of 300,000 people, which is about 4% of the population of Sydney. That's, if it's 350, it's about 5%. And that's incredible. There's a statistic around that said that in circumstance to happen, like a revolution or a regime change, you need 3.5% of the population. And in Sydney, there's clearly a mood to change things. Now, it must be mentioned too that there were a lot of Jewish people there. So the claims that it was anti-Semitic left and the anti-Semitic far right uniting were nonsense. Certainly it was a very broad march. There were very conservative Muslim people there. There were radical hippies there, but there was everybody else in between. And I think even the Prime Minister's words have changed somewhat, and he's now considering how they can walk away from their previous position of support for Israel without losing face, without making it seem that this wasn't the most obvious thing to do in the start. And people came from all over Sydney too. The train stations were filled with people going home. The bus stops were filled with people going home in all directions. So they can't even, which I think came up briefly, I was just a few members of the trendy Inner West latte. One, there's not 300,000 of us. Two, the trendy Inner West latte sipping Republican crowd obviously live in the Shire, obviously live in Baulkham Hills, obviously live on the northern beaches, obviously hold on, we're not in the Inner West anymore. It was extraordinary that there were no arrests, that the crowd remained patient, the crowd remained kind to each other. And here I've got to praise, at least in part, some of the police's actions. The police kept it calm. They clearly didn't want it to happen. And there is an argument that 300,000 people is a lot of people to manage and may have been beyond. But it happened, and they let it happen for the most part with professionalism, with allowing people to act peacefully. As I said, no arrests. That's extraordinary. Nobody's tempers ran high and start screaming at police, and police didn't feel irritated enough to start arresting willy-nilly. Humans will act as humans. It was an extraordinary day.
And I agree with you, David. I think the police were very well behaved, just like the crowd. But after the event, the police came out and actually said, or they had these messages that the march was perilous or dangerous. But as far as I could see, the only perilous action came from the police, and this was the only issue that was not so great during the event itself. But they decided that halfway through the march, police on their helicopters shouted out instructions to the crowd to stop and turn around. And when you ask a crowd of 300,000 people to turn back on themselves, well, you are going to get chaos. And the feeling on the ground was that this seemed to be a predetermined act by the police. And I don't know if it was or if it wasn't, but that's what the feeling was. But ultimately, there was no chaos. It was a peaceful protest, and it was a very powerful statement. And just looking at those numbers, the opponents of the march have said, well, hang on, there are only 90,000 people. That doesn't mean very much at all. Why would the police lie about the number? Well, the police do actually lie about these numbers, and that's what they do in these cases. And not just here, but all around the world. They generally underestimate crowd numbers as a political strategy to devalue the level of dissent because, well, I guess it's an obvious point, but police do not want any dissent at all. And it's also to discourage people in the future. And then they're not going to come and say, well, look, the protest was a complete success. That's not their role anyway. But I think the actual number of people that were there is sort of beside the point anyway. But whatever the case is, critics will use whatever they can to downplay an event, especially if it doesn't match up with their agenda. But the pro-Israel lobby, they've dismissed the event as unrepresentative. Well, it might not be as representative of their extremist right-wing views, but it is representative, or it was representative of the community. And they've also strangely said that this event turned the Sydney Harbour Bridge into an anti-Semitic bridge. And I'm not sure how a bridge can actually do that. Maybe that's an existential question that we could discuss, David. Does the Sydney Harbour Bridge have feelings or not? They also said that it was anti-Jewish, but you referred to this before, David. There were many Jewish people on the bridge walk, and how do you know? Well, they were holding up signs saying Jewish people against Zionism, gay Jewish people against genocide, Jewish students against the Israel lobby. And one of the key speakers at the event was Anthony Lowenstein, the journalist and longtime critic of the Israel government.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am honoured to be here. I speak to you as Australian and also as someone who is a proud Jew who has been so ashamed of what so many in my community have been supporting for the last 80 years, but particularly in the last 2 years. What Israel is doing is not being done in the name of Judaism. They claim it is not. One of the things that I think shocks many people is to realise that within Israel itself, there is what I call genocide mania. This is not an issue with just the Netanyahu government. There is majority support within the Israeli Jewish population for what is going on. These people do not speak for us. They do not speak for me as a Jewish person at all. And they don't speak for people in this crowd here today. We've had for the last 2 years profound lying and gaslighting from our government, from the Albanese government, about what Australia is supporting in Palestine. Let us be clear. Australia has been sending for years, including in the last month, weapons parts for the F-35 fighter jet that goes over Gaza every single day. Australia is complicit in war crimes and genocide. The only way this will stop, is isolation for Israel. There is only one way: sanctions, boycotts and divestment. It is the only way that Israel will stop, and our government must be doing that now.
So there were a lot of Jewish people on this march standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. They were offering a different perspective, but the governments in Australia sided with the conservative Zionists when they should be listening to the other Jewish voices in the community.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. The Jewish community, like the Indigenous community, like the Islamic community, like the Italian community, like the Anglo community, is like the Australian community, of which the vast majority of them are all a part, is not an amorphous, single-minded entity with the exact same opinions. To listen to one side who claim representation is very dangerous. Now, we can know that more, say, Indigenous people lean left, but left is a very broad and loose definition. So even when we say community X leans left or leans right, it doesn't lean uniformly that way. There are varying degrees of nuance and subtlety and disagreement within those communities. So you'll never get everybody's opinion until you get into the real fringe and extreme opinions. But you do want to see what the mainstream is doing. And it's pretty clear that Zionism isn't a majority of Jewish people's ideas. And a lot of Zionists aren't Jewish anyway. We've got to remember that. A lot of Zionists are Christian millenarials and have no real connection to Judaism except they looked in the Old Testament to find bits that agree with their worldview. And that's probably being a bit mean. Hello to all our Christian listeners. You are just as welcome here as everybody else. I'm talking about, of course, the extremes here. It's the danger of letting one group have too much say. One of the interesting things that came up was the role of the anti-Semitism envoy and the role of the Islamophobia envoy. Neither of them were at the march. Neither of them have commented on the march. This is after Gillian Siegel had released a thing saying you should do everything we want, absolutely, and we will brook no compromise. I think it's shown that these positions aren't terribly useful nor needed in the context in which we find them in. And as a result, we've got to get rid of them.
The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he has spoken with the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and also made a promise of $20 million in additional aid for Palestine, and also agreed to meet with him at the United Nations meeting, which is coming up in September. Anthony Albanese also said that he'll be seeking to have a call with the Israel Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Not exactly sure what he's going to say unless he intends to tell him that Australia is going to recognise Palestine and that he also risks arrest if he sets foot in Australia. But aside from that, well, what would be the point? But the other point to all of this is that this is not the end. This should just be the beginning, and it can't just be another cycle of outrage and then we all just go home and forget about all of this. It just has to be this sustained and unrelenting pressure, which is pretty much what it has been over the past 2 years, until Australia finally gets the message and does the right thing, or the Australian government anyway. And 250,000 to 300,000 people, or whatever it was, that is absolutely fantastic. But we also have to remember that 250,000 people marched for reconciliation in the year 2000. And while I'm sure that we've progressed a little bit on reconciliation, 25 years later, true reconciliation is still out of reach. We also had the 250,000 people who protested against the invasion of Iraq on that pretense of weapons of mass destruction in 2003. That invasion did go ahead, but at least the public was right on that there were no weapons of mass destruction. On apartheid, it took 2 decades of global action before apartheid ended in South Africa. And I'm not suggesting that public protests are futile, it's just that it takes a long time for things to turn around, and Palestine might not actually have that much time. And we've been big critics of Foreign Minister Penny Wong, but at least she's saying that recognition of Palestine must happen soon because there might not be anything left to recognise.
We want a ceasefire, we want aid to flow, we want the hostages released, and we would urge Prime Minister Netanyahu to listen to the 600 former Israeli security officials who have called for a ceasefire as the best way to ensure the hostages come home. We want aid to flow. I think Australians are horrified by what we are seeing in Gaza, the human suffering which is occurring, and we would continue to work with the international community to say to Israel, you must let aid in unimpeded. As you know, we have sanctioned Israeli ministers for their human rights abuses of Palestinians. As you know, we have sanctioned settlers for their actions in the West Bank. Yesterday I announced additional aid for Gaza, so additional $20 million through channels that we know have been able to deliver aid in. And we are working with the international community towards the UN meeting in September in relation to a pathway to two states. The best way to ensure peace and stability in the Middle East is for there to be two states. And the reason for urgency behind recognition is this. There is a risk that there will be no Palestine left to recognise if the world does not act.
And that's all well and good, but if she and Albanese had acted sooner, and they haven't started acting yet as far as I'm concerned, but if they had have done all of this beforehand, had shown some moral leadership instead of political caution and cowardice, well, maybe we wouldn't be watching a nation reduced to rubble and an ongoing genocide.
One of the great tragedies, I think I've said this before, but the career trajectory of Penny Wong, who was one of the most consistent thinkers, one of the best thinkers, one of the most formidable debaters, and had the runs on the board in terms of marching with refugees, in terms of protecting and defending her left views. And to see her kowtowing and being cowed by Zionists and Israel and using phrases like non-lethal weapon. Now, I understand that she's a member of cabinet, that she's bound by cabinet decisions, that as foreign minister, the radical firebrand often has to temper their rhetoric and even their beliefs to be able to do the job effectively. But at what point have you gone too far that it's no longer within a compromisable area of your belief? And at what point is it untenable? That's only a question she can ask, but I wonder if she's been asking it.